Jan Janse Weltevree was the first Dutchman in the kingdom of Joseon, and he would be followed by other Dutchmen who became, one of them at least, became much more famous, but in many ways Jan Janse Weltevree was perhaps the most successful Dutchman in Joseon because he fully assimilated into society and had a career and a family there. In 1653 he was called to Jeju-do because other castaways had appeared there and had been taken prisoner by the local magistrate and his soldiers, and when he arrived, to his surprise and undoubtedly also to his pleasure, it turned out that they were compatriots, they were also Dutchmen. Hendrik Hamel and his crew had shipwrecked, had been in a shipwreck and had landed in Jeju-do and had been taken prisoner by the magistrate of Joseon. Now, in order to fully understand the story of Hendrik Hamel, and of Weltevree I should add, I do recommend you to know a bit more about the political and diplomatic stance of Joseon after the Manchu invasions in 1636. I'll just mention here that there was a very tense situation with the Manchu court, with the Qing, the name of the dynasty, established by the Manchus, and that the king at that moment in 1653 really had the idea, the notion of trying to invade Qing China, and as such he needed a strong military. This is important to understand what happened to Weltevree and to what happened to Hendrik Hamel. And here you can see the illustrations from the journal he became famous for, and I'll talk about the journal later. The first eyewitness account by a European of Joseon, and these are the original wood prints from the first edition. So these are not the wood prints with elephants and alligators or crocodiles, because they also exist, but they have nothing to do with Joseon, of course, but these are the original ones. Now, what happened? What's the story of Hendrik Hamel? I will not read everything here, but this is his biography in short. He was born in 1630 or thereabouts, worked for the Dutch Indies as a bookkeeper, and in 1653 he boarded a yacht. It's a relatively small vessel, the Spareward, to go to Japan. They got caught in a storm and they were shipwrecked, and they shipwrecked on Jeju-do on the way to Japan. They were taken captive. Pakyon, or Jan Janse Weltevree, came, explained who they were, and the entire group was taken to Hanyang, the Joseon capital. And like Weltevree, they were told they would never leave Joseon again. They were given work, they were given a residence, so they had, in that sense, little to worry about, although you can imagine that many of these men will have had families whom they knew that they would never see again. Now, they had a... No, before I go there, let me finish this. This is a much more dramatic story, really, than that of Weltevree, because in 1656 something happens, and I'll go into some more detail later, that results in the expulsion of the entire crew, to the extent that they were still there. Two of them had died by that time, to Jeollado, and they were banished, basically. They stayed there for about 9 years, and 8 of them, including Hamel, escaped to Japan. Hamel writes his report, and that's the first eyewitness account of Joseon written by a European. And Hamel returns to the Netherlands in 1670, and he dies 22 years later. Now, there are some really important differences with what happens to Weltevree. At first, Hamel and his crew, 31 of them, they were welcomed in Joseon. They were given similar opportunities. They were given jobs in the Royal Guard, would be a good translation. They were also prized for their skills in making casting cannon and things like that. So basically the Joseon state thought that they could use the skills that these new foreigners, these castaways, brought with them, so they were given a fairly warm welcome. But then something happened when the Qing embassy arrived, the yearly Qing embassy, and this is still 1657, is still a very tense situation. The relationship with the Qing wasn't very good at this moment. And the Dutchmen are told to stay indoors because the Chinese envoy, the Manchu envoy, is not supposed to see them, because if he sees them, he will have to report on them and have to take them to the Chinese capital. And that's something that the Joseon state wants to avoid. Two of the crew, however, think that this is their way out. They want to go home. And when the envoy is publicly welcomed, they go against their orders. They leave the house they were staying in, and they approach the envoy. Well, they think that by doing this, they are safe. They'll be taken to China. What actually, in fact, happens is that the Joseon government bribes the Qing envoy with a lot of silver, so that he would ignore this incident from happening and wouldn't write it down, wouldn't report it, and he doesn't. And the two are taken into custody and never seen again. And they're probably put to death in the dungeons of the Joseon state. The others are now, because the Joseon state is afraid that this may happen again, they are banished from the capital. The risk of having them in the capital and working on cannon or whatever does not outweigh the risk that the Qing will find out and another problem will emerge. So, different from Weltevree, who spent his entire life in the capital, his life in Joseon, he is, and in the service of the state, these men, 29, are exiled to Toledo, so the southwest of the government of the country. And they're no longer in the service of the state, which means they will have to find a way of staying alive. And their specific skills were no longer necessary, or at least they were not called upon by the Joseon government. So they were basically reduced to very humble status. And if you read his journal, you'll find out that during these years in the southwest of Korea, especially in the winters, they had a very difficult time of it, because they were not allowed to do many things, and they had to go out for firewood and try and sell that. And generally speaking, living was difficult, even though most of them seems to have found Joseon or wives and married and had children, a number of them at least. What you can see here is the mention in the official annals, the Joseon Wangyo Shilok of 1653, in which Pakyon reports on having found truly southern barbarians in Jeju-do, so Hamel and his crew. Now, after 9 years in the southwest of Korea, Hamel and 7 others decide that this has been enough. They want to go home. They don't see a future for them in Korea in this way, in Joseon. So they steal a boat and they prepare meticulously and they sail. There are sailors, of course. They sail all the way to Dejima, where they stayed until they were taken to Batavia. And what happens then is typically Dutch in a not particularly good way. But there was this rule in the Dutch East India Company that if you were a sailor stranded in a foreign country while on duty, that you would be paid your salary for all the time you spent in a foreign country, but on the condition that you would write a report on what you had been through and that you would give all the information you could. So in this sense, this journal is really not very different from the illustrated account of Kodio, which I discussed in a previous lecture. The report on Kodio written by a Song envoy. Now this is very similar because there is a format, was a Dutch East India Company format for these kind of journals. And Hamel basically filled everything in, wrote about his experience in Joseon, and gave us the first eyewitness account of Korea, by a European at least. Now, interestingly, what happened at the time when he was writing his journal is the fact that the Joseon and the Japanese governments were having a very heated debate about what should happen with Hamel and his mates. The Joseon government said, well, these people are Joseon citizens and we want them back. They left the country without our permission. And just like when a Joseon merchant or a fisher is shipwrecked, they're always sent back to us. So there's no difference with these people, send them back to us. And then the Japanese government insisted, interestingly, that given the fact that they were part of the same nationality and of the same people who were staying in Dejima, the Dutch traders, and that the Dutch there were also citizens of Japan, or subjects of the Japanese emperor, they would not be sent back because they were Japanese citizens. Now, this is a discussion that you can't really imagine taking place today, but this shows you the rather flexible and fluid nature of what a citizen of Joseon of Japan was supposed to be. And of course, this is a diplomatic dispute, so we don't know to what extent these statements were really believed, but the fact that you could make the statements means that they were not preposterous, which shows you that ethnicity still then in the 17th century was much more fluid than it became later. Now, onto the journal, because this is why Hendrik Hamel is still famous, at least in Korea and to a certain extent in the Netherlands. It was written to satisfy the Dutch Indies Company's curiosity or demands regarding unknown territories. So he wrote it, as I mentioned before, according to a fixed format. It was the first European eyewitness account of Joseon, and as such, it became incredibly popular. Everybody wanted to read it. A huge bestseller, because nothing was really known about Joseon in Europe. And this was the first eyewitness account. And if you look at the journal itself, it's a fairly reliable account of Joseon. It doesn't contain any strange kind of facts or spectacular things that were definitely not true. Once it was published, it was translated to many different languages, and it obtained new illustrations. The illustrated account of Kodio, which I mentioned before, ironically doesn't have any illustrations anymore. Those were lost. But the journal of Hendrik Hamel does have illustrations, and some of them were just concocted by the publisher because it was thought that adding pictures of exotic animals like elephants and like alligators would make the book more of a bestseller, which I guess turned out to be true. Now, this is not the end of the story. You'd think this is the end, but Hamel and his crew had returned through Batavia, Decima, Batavia, and then to Holland, but they wanted to go back to Joseon again. Apparently it was never their intention to leave Joseon behind and never to return. Most, if not all, had married Joseon women after all and had their children in Joseon. They probably gambled on this scenario. They would go to Japan, then perhaps back to the Netherlands, stay there for a while and explain what kind of country Joseon was and interest the Dutch Indies Company in opening up trade relations with Korea. They spoke the language, they knew the country, and they thought that they could function as ambassadors, as middlemen, and go back to Korea, but as free men, as Dutchmen, who were able to leave the country, to go inside the country and leave again, who were able to see their family there, and perhaps also make a nice amount of money as people, in between people in this trade. This, however, never happened. They were successful to the extent that the Dutch Indies Company indeed built a ship called the Korea, which is a clear sign of their intentions. They wanted to open trade relations with Korea, but as soon as they undertook any kind of concrete step to open up dialogue with Joseon, the Japanese government intervened and acted very decisively and basically told them, if you threaten our monopoly with Joseon, and to be honest, Japan did not have a monopoly on trade with Joseon, but it did have an important, among other things, silver trade with Joseon, then you're finished. We'll kick you out of the country and Dejima will be over. And it was decided in the Netherlands, at the Dutch Indies Company's headquarters, that this was too much of a sacrifice to open trade relations with a country that none of them really knew. So they decided not to endanger trade with Japan, which had as a consequence that none of the people who escaped Joseon would ever be back and see their families. It's a very sad story in the end. Now, these are some of the keywords that bring everything together. Of course, Hendrik Hamel, the most famous of the 30-odd people who were shipwrecked in Joseon, the most famous because he was the one who could write and was educated because he was the bookkeeper. So he wrote the journal. I imagine the others could have written it as well in terms of content, but perhaps they couldn't write well enough. We don't really know. Again, the Dutch East Indies Company is important here. It's the the company that made possible all these voyages. The background of the difficult relationship with the Qing sets the political stage, and the actions of two of the crew members who would pay with their lives for their action by approaching the Qing envoy ended in banishment. And this set into motion, in the end, the escape to Japan, the writing of the journal, Hamel's journal, which is now, I guess, world famous, which was not given its logical consequence in opening trade relations with Japan, with Korea, although the Dutch East Indies Company showed signs that it was interested. It built a ship which it named after the Dutch name for Korea, Korea. But the very profitable trade with Japan through Dejima made it impossible for Hendrik Hamel and his crewmates to ever return, and for the Dutch to open trade relations with Joseon.